Hello, welcome. A very, very big welcome to you all. It is great to have you here as part of the this leadership webinar and leading in anxious times. My name is Andrew Groza. I am the State Director of Alphacrucis College here in Victoria. For those of you who maybe are a little bit unfamiliar with Alphacrucis College, we are a Christian tertiary institution, an educational institution that exists to equip Christian leaders to change the world. We actually care about leadership. It's at the core of who we are, and we believe that if we are able to equip people help them develop in their heart and their character, and just with the skills necessary, that they will be able to lead well and influence the world for the cause of Christ. And so it's great to have you all here. We're stoked that you could join us. It's no question we are living in a very challenging environment. Leadership will always attract its fair share of stresses and challenges, that's to be sure. But 2020 has been a year like no other. Who would have thought at the beginning of the year we would have those bushfires that just raged across Australia, this pandemic, race protests in the midst of a pandemic. I mean, you name it, it's just been quite challenging. For those who live in Victoria, of course, we just announced stage 4 restrictions over the weekend. So it's definitely a very anxious time. It's a time where there's a lot of stress and anxiety around. And I thought to myself just a few weeks back when stage 3 restrictions were announced in Victoria, oh, it'd be great if we can get someone to be able to come and to speak to leaders to help them process this challenging time. And so I reached out to Steve Cuss, and he was only more than willing to join and to be able to speak into the lives of leaders right across Australia. I first heard Steve not too long ago when he was interviewed on the Kerry Newhoff Leadership podcast, and he was utterly fantastic. I knew that he would be perfect for this. Steve is an author, he's a podcaster, he consults with leadership teams right across the world, and it is just brilliant to have him with us. And he's an Aussie to boot, even though he lives in the States. So Steve, a very, very big welcome to you. It's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, excellent to be with you guys. Thanks very much for hosting me. And boy, I've been praying for you guys leading up to this, just that this would be relief. Honestly, that's my prayer, is that some of the things we can chat about today and the ways we can interact can just be a relief to you. As Andrew said, I'm an Aussie. I was born and raised in Perth. My parents now live on the southwest corner in Albany. My sister lives in Freo, just down the road. And I moved to America in 1992, thinking I'd come back home. And it's a long story for another day, but here I am in Colorado. And of course, people here think I sound very Australian, and Aussies think I sound ridiculously American. So kind of a weird speaking in tongues thing is what I've got going on there. But Andrew asked me to come and chat with you guys, as he said, about anxiety. And I'm sorry to say that I'm somewhat of an expert in anxiety. Paul says in the Bible, he's the chief of sinners. In some ways, I'm the chief of anxiety. And what's interesting is I never would have described myself that way when I was a teenager or even early in my 20s. I think in some ways a classic Aussie, she'll be right, not easily flustered. But it was when I was 24 years of age, my first ever ministry job after I finished my theological training, I was plunged into trauma chaplaincy and hospice chaplaincy. And I'll never forget the first day on the job. I'm 24. I'd been married for a week. In fact, the day before my job, my brand new wife and I had been on our honeymoon. And she drops me off at the hospital for my first day, and I'm carrying my little overnight bag because I was doing a 28-hour overnight shift where you spend the night, you're on call all night. And there were 6 of us new chaplains, and the chaplain supervisor was touring us through the hospital. There were 600 and something beds in 11 floors. And so we're just walking through the hospital and he's introducing us, this is the pediatrics and this is the heart transplants and this is the emergency room and all of that. And at one point, my beeper went off. This is in the 1990s. And I had so many beepers because I was the on-call guy that I wasn't sure which beeper was which. And I turned to the supervisor. His name was Randy. For Aussies, let's call him Randall so we can all be okay. And I turned to Randall and I said, which beeper's the blue beeper? And he said, that's the code team. It's time for you to go. And the code team is the team that rushes into the room anytime someone's heart stops anywhere in the hospital. And the chaplain's supposed to be there too. So while the doctors and nurses are in the room doing their thing, the chaplain sits patiently with a family and waits. We wait right outside the door. You can hear everything going on in the room behind you. So I said, okay, the code team. All right, someone's heart stopped. I'd been about an hour and a half into the shift. And I said to him, well, what do I do now? And he looked at me and he said, well, I guess we're all about to find out, aren't we? And I was the kid. There were 6 new chaplains. I was far and away the youngest. And I thought he was just giving me a hard time because I was the kid, But I looked at him and his face was very kind. He wasn't giving me any more information, but he was kind. And I said, okay, well, what if I make a mistake? Because I'd never seen a dead body before. I'd had 0 experience with grief. I was completely green. And I think I naively assumed that they would give me some kind of training. But it turned out I was in a particular form of ministry training that has this strong philosophy of throwing you in the deep end, just literally kicking you off the cliff, not even asking if you can swim first. And then what they would do is every morning after your shifts, you'd debrief for an hour and a half. The model of learning is called action, reflection, action. You go do, then you reflect, and then you go do it again. And they blame Jesus for it. When Jesus sent the disciples 2 by 2 and they're packing everything, they're comfortable, or and he's just like Yoda from Star Wars, just tearing through their rucksacks, making sure they had nothing to go. And so off I went to this situation. And before I knew it, I was in a room. The matriarch of the family had died, and there were about 12 screaming people, family members. One of them was headbutting the wall, just over and over and over in a rhythm. One of them was vomiting in a rubbish bin. One of them was just like punching the air. It was unbelievable. I'd never seen anything like it. And that was my first ever experience with what I would call unhinged grief. And my job as the chaplain was to somehow lead these people through this experience and try to bring the peace of Christ in this most anxious situation. So I'm going to share a little bit about my own journey, but I think, Andrew, do we have those slides? Is that going to work out?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first question I want to ask, and I'm going to invite you actually just to pop some thoughts into the chat, is what do you do when you don't know what to do? In other words, what I'm asking is what happens under the surface in you when you don't know what to do? If you're in any kind of ministry leadership, I don't care how long you've been a leader, you are in situations probably every week where you don't know what to do. And unfortunately for us, COVID has given us, how would you say it, a unique opportunity to get in the habit of not knowing what to do. What I'm going to ask you to do is to really start to think about what happens under the surface in you. What kind of stories do you tell yourself when you're in a situation when you don't know what to do? Now, here's the thing. Everybody lives their life where oftentimes they don't know what to do. But when you're a leader, you don't know what to do in front of people. And that's different. It's different when you don't know what to do and you're the one that's supposed to. And so here I am as the chaplain, and I walk into the room, there's 12 screaming people, and I have no idea what to do. And I look around and I saw 3 or 4 people, and they all had white lab coats and stethoscopes on. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, well, the doctors and nurses are here. They'll know what to do. So I just kind of hung back. About 30 seconds later, I look around and they're all gone. And I'm the only staff member in the room with this screaming family. Because, of course, the doctors and the nurses looked around and they said, oh, the chaplain's here. He'll know what to do. sometimes it doesn't matter whether you know what to do or not. If you're the leader, you have to do something. And the first step to noticing your anxiety is learning to pay attention to the gap that resides between doing something and not knowing what to do. And there's all kinds of stuff that happens in that gap. This was the first time in my life, and I couldn't have said it at the time. It took quite a lot of reflection. I was a chaplain for a year. I averaged about 70 hours a week, these overnight shifts, every morning debriefing with the supervisor and my peer group for an hour and a half every morning. It took me a while to realize, as much as I project this cool, laid back, not easily phased Aussie, what's actually true about me is under the surface, it's actually a very thin veneer, that kind of Aussie thing that I do where, hey, no worries, she'll be right, all of that. Under the surface of that veneer is this volcano of anxiety that is always just on the edge of erupting. And anytime I don't know what to do, anytime I'm under pressure, anytime I'm exhausted or feeling threatened or attacked, this volcano bubbles up under the surface. So with this family, I walk in, I don't know what to do, they're screaming. And at some point, the charge nurse from the intensive care, she comes into the room and she's angry at me. I've never met her. I've only been on the job for like 2 hours at this point. I've never even met this woman, but she walks in and she's angry at me. Now, at the time, I couldn't name this, but over time, I was able to name that there's something in me that needs to please a stranger. I'm a chronic people pleaser. I always have been, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. But suddenly, this nurse is angry at me, and she claps her hands really loud, and she says, "Come on, chaplain, let's get the family in to visit their mum. We need to turn the sheets, clean the sheets, turn the bed. We've got another patient waiting. Get him in, get him out. Let's go." And she leaves. Now, what happens if I'm not aware of what I need in a moment is I start operating out of my false needs instead of what the moment requires. So what the moment required was a lot of time and a lot of patience. It took me about 3 hours to get this family settled in a way that we could even have a conversation.
Mm.
But because this nurse walked in angry and because I'm a chronic people pleaser, suddenly my false needs showed up. And I had to please this nurse, and I was no longer serving the family. I was now serving this nurse because I didn't know what to do. I guess that's what you do. You hustle a grieving family in and get them out so that we can be efficient, right? Another false need I was able to identify over the course of this year is I need people to think I'm very intelligent. If I ever think someone thinks I'm stupid, boy, does this anxiety show up in me. So, for example, if someone's trying to sell me something, I'm highly suspicious because they're trying to trick me and they're not going to trick me. And I get combative. If like a telemarketer calls me on the phone, I have to actually work to not be combative. And so anytime I don't know what to do, I feel stupid. And anytime I feel stupid, I feel exposed. Like everybody in the room knows I'm stupid. And in that moment, I'm no longer acting out of the interest of what this family needs. I'm now trying to manage my own anxiety. So what I'm talking about here is a clinical term, and it's known as chronic anxiety. And there's all kinds of anxieties. There's post-traumatic stress disorder. There's generalized anxiety disorder. There's acute anxiety. I'm not going to get into those today. The only one I'm going to talk to you about is chronic anxiety, because chronic anxiety is the bread and butter anxiety that most leaders carry. And most of us may not be aware that we're carrying it. And most of us are not aware of the impact it has on our well-being and the impact it has on our leadership. So
Steve,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt. If I'm hearing you correctly, and you do mention this in your book, what you're saying is when you're confronted with a significant and anxious environment, the first thing to do is to kind of take a step back and look at ourselves. I think you use the phrase in your book, first check your own pulse. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So what you learn to do is once you can start to notice what's going on in you, then rather than it having you in its grip, you can start to flip the power dynamic and now manage it. Yeah. So if we have time, I'll just catch us up on the different kinds of anxiety, and then we'll start to actually help everyone diagnose some
Brilliant.
of your unique sources. Because anxiety is a big word. We talk about it a lot nowadays. We live in an anxious age. But here's the thing, like PTSD is an actual traumatic event in the past. I'm not going to go into all the different anxieties. Let me just talk about acute anxiety and then chronic anxiety, and that'll help us name it. Acute anxiety is an actual moment that's short term when you actually might be in danger. Like if you're driving down the freeway and the cars in front of you suddenly brake and you think you're going to hit them and you have to swerve out of the way and your heart races. That's a temporary situation where you are actually in danger. That's acute anxiety. But with acute anxiety, you can pull over, you can take the next, road and settle down and grab a little ice cream or something and calm yourself down. But chronic anxiety, it's not an actual threat, it's a perceived threat. So in my case, people pleasing isn't actually going to kill me. If somebody doesn't like me, my life is not in danger. But here's the thing, it's not short term, it's constant. And my body can't tell the difference between acute anxiety and chronic anxiety unless I train it.
Right.
Your body does not naturally know when you're actually in danger, like a car wreck or something, and when you think you're in danger, like, for example, for some of you, being a perfectionist, having to always get it right the first time, unless you start to train it. So yeah, first taking your own pulse is a key lesson in paying attention to what's going on in you before you just move into a leadership situation. So Andrew, let me pause there and see which way you want to go, because obviously we can go a few different directions, but we can work on the physiology and help folks start to diagnose it.
No, I'm happy for us to go down the path of learning to just be present or to recognize what's going on internally. I think that's a good place to go. Just before we get there, though, like you mentioned, the potential of flipping a power dynamic of, instead of anxiety managing us, we're able to hold that and look at it a little bit more objectively, and instead of anxiety holding us, we hold it. How does being aware of the anxiety that we feel kind of help accomplish that?
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Like, so every one of us, I believe, are in a fairly hefty grip of anxiety, of chronic anxiety. And it's most keenly displayed when you don't know what to do. That's a great context for you to start. If you put yourself in a situation where you don't know what to do, you can actually start to pay attention to your assumptions about what the world has to be like in order for you to be okay.
Right.
And so one of my assumptions is people have to think I'm intelligent. People have to like me. And unfortunately for me, I'm quite intuitive, so I can tend to read people. So if I think for some reason someone doesn't like me, I'll actually start to get anxious instead of connecting with them. I'll be operating out of my anxiety instead of them. And so, like, even in the chat here, Amanda said, I act confidently as if I know what I'm doing. That's a great example of somebody who's able to name what you do when you're anxious. And suddenly maybe you're overcompensating, or maybe you're being overconfident or something like that, but you're no longer able to serve what the occasion requires. You're certainly no longer able to walk by faith. You're no longer following God. You're now in the grip of your anxiety. John says in 1 John, perfect love casts out all fear. It's really difficult to be in the grip of God's presence and in the grip of chronic anxiety at the same time. One of them typically kicks the other one out.
Wow.
And so I think chronic anxiety is deadly for a leader, because oftentimes when we're in the grip of it, we actually forget that God's with us. We're no longer operating by faith. We're now operating out of our own kind of false need.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I had a experience of that even recently in a staff meeting where something came up, and all of a sudden something was requested. My mind is starting to spin. I'm thinking, oh wait, I'm not ready for that. And then I acted out of my anxiety, which actually just made the situation worse. So I'm hearing you and having a bit of a chuckle and reflection. So why don't you talk us through what happens physiologically and how we can be a little bit more aware of it?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Anxiety doesn't start physiologically, it just manifests there. So I
Right.
found that to be the easiest way for people to first start to notice their anxiety. Because typically with chronic anxiety, you don't know you're anxious until you're really, really anxious. So what I like to do is we'll put this slide up for you all. Is I'm going to ask people to pop in the chat if you're comfortable, and just let us know out of the choices of a spinning mind, a racing heart, or a tightening body, where would you say anxiety starts for you? Where do you first notice anxiety? And I'll give you a couple of examples. If you already know, you can go ahead and put it in the chat. For some of you, you're looking at this and you're saying, I'm doomed. It's all three. No problem. There's lots of good news for you. Don't be alarmed. That's a completely reasonable answer. But a spinning mind, that's mine. I know I'm anxious when I start thinking harder and I'm trying to worry my way to peace. And even though I've never in my life successfully worried my way to peace, the sign that I'm anxious is it's like my brain, it's like a rat on a wheel, right? For some of you, it's a racing heart. It's like you've had 10 cups of caffeine and you're just jittery. And then for some of you, it's a tightening body. That can either be like a sickening feeling in your gut, like butterflies, or sometimes it's like you're constantly trying to get someone to give you a shoulder rub or a clenched jaw. These are your choices. If you're able to put in the chat, where does it start for you? And I'll just be reading some of your answers here. So yeah, Phil said spinning mind. Ben said racing heart. Natalie's brave. She names racing heart and spinning mind. We've got lots of spinning minds, racing hearts here. Oh, here we go, Kerry. Good job, all three. All right, that's very good. Just feel free to keep jumping in here with your response. You know, Andrew was asking, you know, how do you flip the power dynamic? It's the craziest thing. If you confess it, you get power over it. And I don't quite know why. The Bible talks about confession, but just by typing this out, you actually just get a little bit of a power dynamic where now that you know how it is, it will have you less in its grip. It's just the craziest thing. And so as for some of you, you might be very aware of this. For some of you, this might be brand new material. What you can start doing today, because you will wrap this up around noon and you've got the rest of the day to practice. You can start noticing when your body is expressing anxiety. And then, and we'll get to these by the hour, you can start intervening sooner. So in my life, I used to worry and worry and worry for days and days and days. And now, if I go to bed worrying about it, and the first thing as I wake up, I'm worrying about it, that's when I start my intervention. I don't let myself go more than 12 hours before I say, right, that's enough. I'm now going to ask God to help come in and intercede, because chronic anxiety, remember, is based on a false need. You don't actually need the thing you think you need to be okay. And so we can get to that in a little bit. Andrew, I'm just going to have a quick word to those who said all three, because it's very brave for you to put that out there. All that means, those of you who put all three, all that means is anxiety gets such a grip on you before you're aware of it that it's through your whole body. So the good news for you is you can begin today starting to notice where it begins. It's very unusual for anxiety to show up and grab you everywhere. It usually starts somewhere. For me, it starts in the mind and it usually ends in my tightening body. But if those of you said all three, if you can start to be hyper aware of it, then you can start to intervene.
Wow, that's excellent, Steve. So give us an example, a concrete example of, okay, something has happened. What does the intervention actually look like for you?
Yeah, good. So step one is physiology. And that's all part of that idea of just pausing before going in. Step two is what I'd like to try now, which is see if you can name something that you think you need that you don't really need. I've already shared for me people pleasing, appearing intelligent, The longer I live, the more I'm uncovering them. About 10 years ago, I discovered I'm a minister. I preach sermons. I need every sermon I ever preach to be the best sermon they've ever heard ever every week. And if you notice how specific I was on that,
Yeah,
the
at least you're not
more,
setting high goals. So that's good.
but the more concrete I get, the more power I have over it. And so if we're okay doing this, I'm going to invite people to try popping in the chat. What is something that you think you need that you don't really need? I'm not generally a perfectionist, but I've got friends who are perfectionists. I've got a friend, he would say, I believe the lie that I need to get it perfectly right the first time, every time. So even if I've never done it before, I expect myself to get it perfectly right the first time. So I can give some more guidance if we need, but let's see. Hope's already jumped, or Hope Academy's already jumped in about the appearance of being in control. Yeah, that's got to be lovely. Yeah, Amanda's resonating with perfectionism. We'll just give you some time and see if what else comes up here. Okay, so church office, I'm sure that's not your birth name. Interesting that you changed your name to church office. That's real dedication to your vocation, but still. So Mr. or Miss Office said, to understand what I'm saying the first time around. Oh, Michael. Okay, very good, Michael. Yes, I think what you're saying there, Michael, is you need people to understand what you're saying without having to explain yourself over and again. Yeah, very good. Sam, validation that who I am and what I do is of value. Yes. So in Sam's case, I can't speak for Sam, but it's probably like if you don't feel seen in a conflict, if you feel misunderstood, for example, you probably get very anxious. Okay, we've got some really great feedback in here. So Andrew, the third step then is to actually name it to somebody. This has been a great start, but to find somebody that you trust who's safe. Maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a coworker, and to actually have the courage to say to them, I believe the lie that I need, for example, to appear like I know what's going on and that I always know the best solution. You actually literally say it to somebody, and it's as soon as you say it, what's going to happen is you're going to say to yourself, that is the craziest thing. Like, who could possibly ever live up to that standard? Mm. And it begins to dislodge the grip that lie has on you. Chronic anxiety is almost always based on a lie that you believe. And the beauty of the gospel is that we believe truth sets us free. And so I tend to use two prayers. And Andrew, I think we have them on the slides. Otherwise, I can type them here. Yeah. The first prayer is, Jesus died to free me from needing blank anymore. Jesus died so I don't have to blank anymore. Jesus died so I don't have to give gold standard sermons anymore. I can get up and preach a boring message and my identity is fine. Jesus died so I don't need to win the approval of everybody anymore. Oftentimes, now that I know about myself, these tendencies, like, for example, the need to look intelligent, what that'll look like for me in a meeting is I believe the lie that no matter what people ask, I must have the answer. Now, that's crazy. Who among us has the answer, especially in COVID? Boy, this is a great opportunity to learn to say, I don't know a whole lot. But I believe this lie that I need to have the answer. So let's say I'm going into maybe an elders meeting, and our elders, we only meet once a month, and these are volunteers at our church. They're really good people, but they're tasked with overseeing the church. They're my boss, but they'd never been trained in ministry. And so they ask the most random questions any given month, just whatever comes into their head about the church. It's pretty wild. And if I'm not aware of my false need of looking intelligent, I can get really defensive. I can get really combative. But now that I know that, as I'm walking into the elders meeting, I'm literally saying to God, you died to free me from needing to have the answer anymore. I can go into this meeting with these good people and they can ask a reasonable question and I can simply say, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. Maybe I can find it or I can help you find it. So Jesus died so I don't have to blank anymore, and you can fill in your own blank. Then the second one that I've been really compelled by just in the last couple of years, what if I were at least as blank to myself as God is? What if I were at least as patient with myself? What if I were at least as kind to myself? Why is it, let's say in COVID, that I expect myself to get it right in a situation I've never been in before? What if I were at least as patient with myself to make mistakes as God is? This one came out of some work I've been doing with people on the inner critic. You know, that voice in your head that's generally harsh and condemning? What I've noticed is we tend to portray that inner critic onto God because we're carrying all this shame and we can't handle it, so we externalize it. If you believe God sounds just like your inner critic, you're not following the one true God, Jesus Christ. You're following a man-made God. You're following Zeus. You're following like just one of the many thousands of false gods that are always angry and disappointed and, vengeful. And so what if I were at least as kind to myself as God is? So often what happens with chronic anxiety is we know the gospel intellectually. God is love. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus. Anytime our hearts condemn us, John says in 1 John 3:20, this is how you set your heart at rest in God's presence. Anytime our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our hearts and he knows everything. It's an amazing verse. And yet what we tend to do is we tend to say, well, I'm going to believe my own inner critic over the good news of Jesus. And I'm going to operate out of my own condemnation and shame rather than really operating out of being the beloved in the identity of God. So obviously I covered a lot of territory there. I'll just pause, Andrew, and see where you want to go from there.
Well, that is fantastic. So you're one of the things that you're saying is being able to address chronic anxiety in us, not just in the moment. So a situation occurs, an elders meeting or whatever situation occurs. There's some anxiety that's there, but the process of managing our anxiety actually starts even before that event. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so I just need to say in my church, I teach this over an 8-month class and you and I get to spend an hour together.
Yeah.
So the problem we have here is some of our folks here are perfectionists, and I'm teaching you just enough to add to your condemnation, where now that you know, you're now going to say, well, I should know better by now. But if you consider managing anxiety like going to the gym and getting in shape, it's going to take some reps. You're out of shape and it's going to take a lot of practice. And that process I just led you through, from noticing your physiology, naming a source, and then dying to it and being free in Christ, to where you can do that going into a situation. For some of you, that might take months, and that's fine. That might take months. And I'm sorry to say, the best way to speed up the process is bravely practice. So I'm just looking at our chat here. So Ben, I'm going to call you out. I hope this is okay. Seeming calm as a leader. What Ben does is he wants to portray that he looks calm regardless of what's going on under the surface. If Ben wants to bravely practice, what he should be doing in these next few weeks is admitting to his team his anxiety. If he's in the grip of needing to appear calm, then the way to bravely practice is let your team know, hey, I'm way more anxious than I get on. In fact, I'm so anxious, I work hard at looking non-anxious. That's how anxious I am. That's brave practice. For Phil, you put people to approve of me as a leader. The way Phil practices, he actually finds somebody. This is crazy, but he actually finds somebody who he knows is critical of his leadership. And he grabs lunch with that person. And then Phil is going to act like he's a sociologist, like he's floating above himself. And rather than being caught up and linked to this person's criticism, where this criticism is a straight shot to your chronic anxiety, Phil's actually going to notice the way he acts and reacts to this person. And he's going to practice walking away from that lunch being criticized and being okay. Now, I make it sound way easier than it is. I don't want to make it like I'm not Yoda. I still get anxious every day. I still deal with this every day. But as you practice and as you put yourself in the situations that used to make you anxious, the very situations you used to avoid, you'll be blown away at your capacity to stay connected to people, even though they're putting pressure on your anxiety.
That's profound. So in a moment, this is to everybody, we will have a time for live Q&A. So capture your questions. We won't put them in the chat. There is another function there called Q&A, and I'll encourage you to capture your questions and put them in the Q&A box as we're going along. And the last little bit of our time together, we will do some live Q&A. Now, Steve, you mentioned that when you teach this out, it takes a long time. You go into a lot more depth in terms of family systems theory and some of the other things that you have been studying and experimenting and specializing in for the last few years. One way that people can practice or learn a lot more, obviously, is connecting with you, and we'll give your details out near the end. We do have your sensational book, Managing Leadership Anxiety, yours and theirs. Fantastic book. You've got some brilliant quotes in there that just completely blow me away, both from yourself as well as from other people. There's that one from Friedman about, there is, I think it was from Viktor Frankl about, there is stimulus and then there is space between stimulus and action. So that was absolutely brilliant. But I want to maybe change tack slightly. You talk about managing your leadership anxiety. The first step, obviously, is to be self-aware and to practice at dying to self and so on. Managing yours, but you also talk about managing theirs. Now, we are in a fascinating, interesting, challenging situation in our society with this pandemic that is still out there. Lots of people are anxious. I want to ask you two questions. One, what have you seen in terms of how people have responded during this time? But then also, okay, how do we address that? How can we, in a Christ-like way, manage that and seek to lead them into healthy spaces? So a bit convoluted, but question one, what has been some of the responses that you have seen from people during this time?
Oh man, lots of hostility, that's for sure. Lots of opinions, lots of certainty in an uncertain time. It's interesting, isn't it? Because, we all go into isolation. I know, I'm really sorry for those of you in Victoria with the lockdown. It's so rough. So, we go into isolation to protect each other from catching the virus, but chronic anxiety is more contagious than COVID is. We catch chronic anxiety the way we catch a cold, and it always spreads in a group. And what ends up happening is the most anxious person in any room usually has the most power in that room, particularly in church groups. There's some kind of twisted thing we do in church where we think we have to be nice to the angry person. And so we let them exhibit their anxiety through anger or needing to have the last word or anything like that. So it really is a challenging time to be a leader when you're with a group where not only is each individual in the group anxious, but they're all catching each other's anxiety. If you picture chronic anxiety like a bucket, and pretty much all of us have an overflowing bucket until we do some of this work. And then so anything that adds to it, it just spills over and we just end up dumping it into the first person we can find. So one thing you can do as a leader, this takes practice like the other stuff, you can start noticing anxiety spreading in a group. Some of you've already seen this. Like, let's say you have a staff meeting. It's always the same people that speak up first. It's always the same people that never speak up unless they're spoken to. It's always the same people that stay silent in the staff meeting, and then they have their own private meeting after the meeting. That's just anxiety. That's not honest, direct, Christ-like conversation. That's gossip, basically. And so as a leader, you can start paying attention to the way people are relating to each other, the way people are relating to you. And there's a concept in family systems theory that it's not unique with me. You can Google this and you can watch it on YouTube, get a long way. Concepts known as differentiation. And differentiation is the very difficult skill of stopping your anxiety from spilling onto someone else and stopping their anxiety from being caught by you. So particularly those of you who are parents, raising kids is usually brilliant practice for differentiation because you're so kind of enmeshed with each other. But it's the ability for you to be okay when the person you love is not okay. If it tends to be that if someone else is not okay, you're not okay too, you're actually enmeshed with that person. And so a lot of what we do training leaders is we help them practice the art of differentiation. So they're able to walk into a highly anxious situation, be very aware of their own anxiety, their own triggers, be very aware of God's presence that was already there before you showed up. And you can now attend to yourself, to the God who made you, and to the people and what's going on. And you'll be amazed at how much more anxiety you can manage in people when you're first managing yourself. So that would be my initial advice on just how you walk into a highly hostile or anxious group. Is you really do have to take your own pulse and manage yourself. And then what differentiation itself, it's also known as being a non-anxious presence or a calm presence. And even secular family systems theorists, they would point to Jesus of Nazareth as the most differentiated human ever to live. You start noticing the interactions he had with religious officials, and he'd get in a pickle with people, and he was always phenomenally calm. And I know you're probably saying, well, he's God, so he has that advantage. But a lot of what Jesus practiced is differentiation. He didn't get wrapped up in what they wanted. So like in John 8, when the woman's caught in adultery, he just ignored their agenda altogether. And he set his own agenda. That's an example of differentiation. So the slide we've got here is just some helpful questions for you to ask yourself to help you become more differentiated. And really, we're just going to look at the first two, just getting clarity on where do I end and the other begin. Particularly those of you in families where if a loved one is upset and then you're upset, there's no space between the two of you. When is God calling me to carry a burden? When is God calling me to walk alongside? There's two effective ways to truly love someone, but they're very different from each other. I think in Christian circles, we tend to carry burdens too much, and we're not as good at walking alongside. You look at Jesus in Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus, that he's walking alongside very anxious people there as a differentiated person. So Andrew, let me throw back to you and see where you want to head next.
Well, maybe we've got time for one more thought before we go to the live Q&A. But, okay, so differentiation, being able to be yourself, authentically yourself, whilst also walking alongside the other person, really important. Are there any other tools that you can give us to help us de-escalate an anxious situation?
Yeah, I'll actually throw an audible to you, Andrew, which I just realized is a American term. But if you go to slide 29, the whole theory of family systems theory is if you want to de-escalate a group's anxiety, you work the most on yourself. And I know it's counterintuitive, but if you can stay non-anxious, and non-anxious doesn't mean you don't have anxiety, it means you're managing your anxiety and it's not boiling up like a volcano. That's what non-anxious presence means. I actually personally think it's poorly named in systems theory because it gives you the impression that we're all going to be Yoda or some kind of Zen. No, that's not it. It's just that you can walk in aware of your anxiety. And so one helpful tool is to be able to name your default listening posture and then to try to move it to the one that de-escalates. Like out of listening to learn, listening to defend, listening to hijack, listening to fix. Only one of these de-escalates group anxiety. And my tendency is I tend to listen to defend and I tend to listen to fix. I believe the lie that people want me to tell them what to do when oftentimes they just want to be cared for. Another simple posture, particularly nowadays, there's a whole other webinar I do on environmental anxiety. It's got nothing to do with the lies we believe. It's simply environments that generate anxiety. And one of the environments that generates anxiety for anybody is ambiguity. If you're in an ambiguous situation, you're going to be anxious.
Mm.
And so as you're trying to lead through COVID, your churches and your schools, you've got all these anxious people. They want to know, what's the plan? What's the plan? You may not have a plan. And the ability to simply let people know, this is an ambiguous situation. We don't know what to do. We're not going to provide certainty. We're going to provide clarity for you, but that's not the same as certainty. We reserve the right to change our mind as circumstances change. But just that's a way you can de-escalate people's anxiety. If they want certainty, you just have to become really clear on what you can offer them that only feeds the addiction of anxiety, and what you can offer them that actually relaxes them, that's true. So just knowing you're in an ambiguous situation, you're leading into an unknown future, you're going to get it wrong. My church, they've heard this from me a lot. Like, I'll often tell them, I will make mistakes. None of us know what they're going to be. And I'm just praying that I find out before you do, because that's terrible. But you might know the mistakes before I do. But I'm just very open about it. Like, if you're expecting a certain leader that gets it right every time, just fire me now and get someone else in. But most reasonable people don't expect that. It's just their anxiety expecting that. When's my kid going to be back in school? When do we get to worship again together? And your ability to calmly say, we don't know, or to calmly say, here's our plan. It's our best. I know you want us to do this plan, and I know you've read this article. Here's our plan. It might be wrong. It might be wrong. And so we're happy to hear your feedback, but we're going on this plan. You're not going to change our mind. And then we'll repent later if we were wrong. No problem. And we'll try something else. That'll relax you, and it'll relax everybody. And the kind of person that doesn't relax, you don't want them in your organization anyway.
That's great, Steve. And I think that there is definitely a sense of just when a leader stands up and says, hey, I don't know, but this is we've come together, we've thought about it, we're moving in this direction. This is as it seemed good to us and the Holy Spirit, without taking that text out of context. But we've done our homework. This is kind of the best that we do. We don't ultimately know. I just think that's authentic leadership does just kind of deflates any kind of anxiety, or at least the acuteness of it. So yeah, just brilliant. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to move into some live Q&A. Some great questions that have come through. This one's come through from Michael, aka Church Office. So how can I begin to help someone who just can't see that I'm trying to help them in the midst of their anxiety?
Oh, what a great question, Michael. I would suggest, and here's the challenge with Q&A, is I might get the tone or the intent of your question wrong. So please feel free, if you're still around, to correct me if I'm getting it wrong, because obviously it's always a little bit of information, and here I am giving an answer. But so there, I just modeled non-anxious leadership for you. Michael, I would say the next step would be for you to name to someone who cares about you why you feel a need to help them. There's probably something in you that needs to be helpful for somebody that doesn't necessarily want your help. A family systems theorist named Ed Friedman, Andrew referenced him before, he says, you cannot lead somebody who is not moving toward you. And they are likely not going to move toward you if you are chasing them. So again, the caveat is I might have gotten the intent of your question wrong. But generally speaking, if you're trying to help somebody who cannot see you're trying to help them, I would first try to figure out, what is it in me that needs their life to get in order so I can be okay? And then I'd start to wonder, what does it look like to love this person in the midst of their chaos without helping them? That's provocative, but that would be my answer.
That's great. Thank you, Steve. Here's another great question. Have you come across any interesting trends between people's motivations, say particular Enneagram types or other type of personality profiles, and particular false truths about themselves and anxiety triggers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm quite familiar with the Enneagram, and I love the Enneagram, but I don't think I'm well versed enough to train people in it. So I've asked some Enneagram experts this very question, because because family systems theory, which is my background, it climbs in the same house through a different window than the Enneagram. That would be one way to understand. It's just kind of a different way into the same ending of trying to understand yourself and how you operate. And my Enneagram friends say that there's definitely overlap between my false need and my number. Like I'm an Enneagram 3. I need to look impressive. But when it comes to the physiology, it's more about stances and your repressed center. And at this point, I'm parroting what I've heard that I don't fully understand myself. So if that helps you as an Enneagram person, that's great. But my understanding is that I am feeling repressed or thinking repressed. I'm already out of my league. I can feel it. But the reason I worry so much is I'm not as I take in the world through my feelings, but then I move it to my brain. So my Enneagram friends say that's why I have a spinning mind. But I'm definitely just sharing what I've heard, not what I know.
Sure. Well, thank you for sharing even that. I appreciate it. Here's another question. Is dependency, this comes from Judith, is differentiation the same sort of ideas as co-regulation? Example, where an adult who is calm can calm a stressed child?
Outstanding question. Yes. Differentiation is technically a family systems term. I believe co-regulation is an attachment theory term. I think it's very much the same idea. If you are comfortable with that term, then you can just start to explore co-regulation with your anxious team or staff or congregation.
So, Steve, just curious, thinking back, this is a question from me, thinking back to your time as a chaplain, so it took a year, how were you able to process and live and ultimately learn and thrive in that highly anxious environment? What are some of the things that you did to help you kind of process and grow through that?
Yeah. The best tool they made us do was called a verbatim. I give a whole chapter to it in my book. And a verbatim, you simply write out an essay like you did in school, and you type out word for word as best as you can remember it, a leadership encounter where you either didn't know what to do or you were anxious or it didn't go the way you thought it would. And you put it in 2 columns. And in one column is the he said, she said, what you said and what they said. But then the column to the right is what you were thinking and feeling at the time. And then when you're done with that, you actually give a theological reflection. Where was God? Where was the gospel in this encounter? And you also give a reflection. Well, how do I think and feel about it now? And I had to do something like 50 verbatims in my year, and just constantly being in a chair where I had to reflect on how I showed up, pay attention to that right-hand column of what was going on under the surface in me. My early verbatims had very little in the right-hand column. I was very unaware. My later verbatims had much more in my awareness column than the conversation column. At our church with our leaders, we invite them to do verbatims. It's one of the most helpful tools. And then the other tool, it's also a deeper tool called a Genogram or a Genogram. And it's basically a family tree that has emotional and addiction and mental health coding on it. Anyone can do a Genogram. I gave a chapter to that as well. But you can even Google them and find great stuff on YouTube. People Genogram like the Star Wars family and John F. Kennedy family. And you actually start to notice what I've come to call the family propaganda that's been handed down through the generations that you've inherited that you may or may not be aware of. And then we help people figure out where's the gospel and where's your family propaganda. Those are deeper tools, but boy, they're really powerful to really get a handle on this.
Steve, it really sounds to me like if you're going to be an effective leader, especially during a crazy season like this is, but just generally, if you're going to be an effective leader, you're going to need to carve out time to self-reflect and to reflect on particular situations. Would that be about right?
Yeah, I believe you have to carve out time and you have to find a group of people you trust. It only has to be 2 others, but so that all of you, so when I wrote the book, and just so everyone knows, there's lots of great books that and resources that do what I do. I'm not that unique. But I really worked hard on, in my book, to have discussion questions at the end of each chapter that any group of friends could sit down and really get to know each other. there's just something, I don't know what it is, but there's something about naming it to each other that brings tremendous relief. So I would say, yes, carve out time and find a group of people you trust and dive into some of this together. And if you do that over a period of time, you'll be blown away. The results are literally miraculous, I would say.
Wow, that's profound. So not just individual isolated self-reflection, but to do it in community as well.
I think the number one fallacy of the Western church is we think that we grow by learning, by taking in, by internalizing. Read a book or listen to a podcast. In the Bible, we grow by doing, and so you got to do. You got to take it in, then you got to try it on.
Brilliant. All right. Well, one more question before we wrap up. Just trying to decide which one to go with here. All right. So I find the feeling that the need to preach perfectly online increases my anxiety in this season. It's like a permanent record of my mistakes. Any ideas of how I can manage this anxiety?
Yeah. Preaching online is really hard. It's really hard. And so I think it's 18 sermons online now. And it was about 12 sermons in where I said to my congregation, this is still really hard for me. I just let them know. And I think it's really important that you don't do it in a way that brings pity. I'm not interested in getting now, emails and fishing for compliments. It's just, I'm leading through vulnerability. I'm always trying to show my congregation, I'm not a leader. I'm just a human being. I'm a human who loves Jesus, who's helping us try to, love Jesus and be loved by Jesus. Because I think we can tend to believe that leader is a different species than human. And therefore we expect things out of ourselves. So, you have to contextualize. Phil, I think it was that asked that question. You have to contextualize, but it wouldn't bother me at all for you this week to say, what's crazy is I've done so many of these and I'm still so anxious. And here's what I'm anxious about, guys, as I say it once and it's forever on the record. Now, that's one option. The other thing you can do, Phil, if that's not appropriate for you and your group, it just might not, that your church culture, that would not work, is this one's more diabolical, is say something that's wrong on the record, but don't tell anybody. Your next sermon. So the way I overcame my false need to preach perfect sermons every time is I preached a really boring sermon. It didn't make much sense. The points were not coherent, and I didn't tell anybody. I didn't get up and say, hey, everybody, I've got this weird false need. I just preached a bad sermon. This is about 8 years ago now. And I went home and I rested in Christ. So what you could do is you could intentionally say something that's going to be permanently on the record. And what you'll discover is the sun will come up the next day and God still loves you and the congregation will still listen to you next week.
Wow. That's incredibly courageous there, Steve,
that's what you call
slightly
brave
diabolical.
practice.
I love it. It's so good. Well, look, we have come to the end of our time together. Now, 30 minutes, 60 minutes is not going to be enough to really engage with some of these concepts on a deeper level. And so now, Steve, obviously you make yourself available through various different means. How can people connect with you?
Yeah, I use primarily on social media. I'm most active on Twitter. I've got Facebook and Instagram, but those are more personal, and Twitter's where I do my anxiety work. I have a podcast where sometimes I'm talking, but most of the time I'm bringing on a Christian leader. And you can just Google my name in the podcast.
Can I just say that what I really appreciate about your podcast is you've got some non-cheesy music. Like, it's actually really good. I really appreciate that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm a musician, so I'm kind of a musical snob. And then for those who want to dig deeper with me, I mostly do webinars. And I did the 1 hour because Andrew reached out and you guys are the motherland. But normally I don't do anything less than 2 hours because ideally we get on Zoom together up to 50 people or so. And so it's less monologue from me and it's more me facilitating you guys chatting with each other. So anywhere from 2 hours to a full day, we can talk about, webinars and things and really dive much deeper into this.
Fantastic. Well, there's been some links that have just been put up in the chat, so you can engage with that. On behalf of Alphacrucis College, I just really want to say thank you so much, Steve, for your time and your willingness to come be vulnerable. I mean, you're very vulnerable in your book, just when we chatted as well earlier. And so just really want to say thank you so much for taking the journey that you've been on and being able to help other leaders to really make a difference in the world and kind of manage their own anxiety. So appreciate you. Thank you for making the time. And thank you to all of you who attended. Really, really appreciative of your heart to just make sure that you lead well in this season and beyond for the cause of Christ. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Steve, once again. You are a champion. God bless. And just spend the rest of the day doing some work on this stuff. See you later, everyone.